by Alberta. The Premier was on this program at the top of the hour, about 45 minutes ago, detailing why she did that. She's invoking the act, she says, to combat what she characterizes as the unfair imposition of a timeline by the federal government. You heard it there detailed by Minister Guilbeault, of the country reaching a net zero electricity grid by 2035. The Premier insists that that is too soon of a deadline, that 2050 is more realistic. She told me earlier on the program that basically the reason for invoking the Sovereignty Act was because the conversations that are taking place on draft regulations, which were tabled in the summer, are not going well. Essentially, she said the federal government is not in alignment on that 2050 date, and you can hear that. Actually, we did hear that very bluntly from the Environment Minister, and so she wanted to invoke the act. You could hear the minister there kind of fight back against that characterization. He says they're at the table. They won't go to 2050, but there is a lot of room for negotiation about the way in which these regulations are applied and the amount of support the federal government can supply in order to meet the 2035 objective. He also accused the Premier of being motivated by anti-environment ideology. To unpack that back and forth, who else but the front bench? They're patiently standing by. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's now a principal at Shakti Strategies. Shakir Chambers worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. He's now a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. Kathleen Monk is a former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk & Associates, and Laura Stone is a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Thanks for sticking around to listen in. Kathleen, I'll start with you. This is, we know that Alberta and Ottawa are often at odds. The threat of the Sovereignty Act has been there for a while. It's interesting that the Premier decided now was the time to invoke it.
It is really curious because the clean regs, as you reported, aren't even in force yet, right? It seems so extreme to be preempting by bringing forth the Sovereignty Act when these regs haven't even really been finalized, never mind been enforced and to come to fore. And so that's what I find really weird. But I mean, it's consistent with Danielle Smith's point of view, right? She's bringing Alberta a little bit backwards. She wants this fight with the feds. She's basically, in many ways, hindering investment in the province of Alberta, and more than that, kind of putting Canada a little bit on its back foot as we go into COP, right, and the big environmental conference, embarrassing Canada on the global stage, if you will. And so, it doesn't surprise me. She rode into her own leadership battle on the Sovereignty Act, right? This was a policy she brought forward to basically win the leadership of that party. Was bill number one when she became Premier, and now she's using it preemptively. But I think most people who are watching it will see this is a bit extreme.
Sabrina, what about people in Alberta? I think that, and you would be talking to them more than I am, but there is, I think, for the cause itself of fighting back against the timeline, a lot of support. Is that distinguished at all from invoking the Sovereignty Act, or is there widespread support for that too?
So the Sovereignty Act itself, I think, as the minister alluded to, is quite dubious. It's dubious in law, it's dubious in its enforcement. It casts a very wide net. That's why I think the Premier is using it on these draft regulations, like we don't even have legislation to be pushing back on. So I think like whether or not that actually works is quite questionable at this point. But I heard the minister say there that there's no evidence or no reason for Alberta not to be able to meet these targets. And I would actually push back on that. I mean, I think to the Premier's credit, there are both from the business sector and from economists like Andrew Leach, who are not usually on the Premier's side, saying that these are really challenging targets to meet. Do I think that the Premier went, threw a grenade in the mix and went 0 to 100? For sure. I think that there's opportunities to have that conversation. But as of right now, it is looking like it's very challenging to actually meet those regulations. And when you consider that the feds have lost 2 substantial court cases on carbon pricing and on the plastics, when you consider that Alberta has these, economists and businesses on their side, it's not a bad position for the Premier to be putting this forward right now. And let's not forget, she spent $10 million promoting, tellthefeds.ca about this, so she's not going to back down now.
The federal minister, Shakir, also referenced the other court case in which the federal government has been successful, that on carbon pricing. I think there's a political dynamic here, too, to the idea can they or won't they actually walk back or agree to a different target, extending the target for Alberta? I mean, it's against the backdrop of what happened that we've been talking about for many weeks around a carve out for the carbon tax more generally for home heating oil. That happened a few weeks after Stephen Guilbeault, in reference to this issue, said, no, that would be unfair. Any kind of carve out would be an unfair way to kind of go about things. Do you think they've kind of boxed themselves in a corner here?
I think on that, sorry, on that issue specifically, I think the premier does smell a bit of weakness in the environmental policy. I know what Minister Guilbeault said, but I think if you're Danielle Smith and you've seen that, for years the federal government said there would never be carve-outs on carbon pricing, and then one day, we're going to have this carve-out for Atlantic Canada. I think Premier Smith sees it as the government recognizes when you have national environmental or national energy policies, they obviously affect regions differently, and because of that, you should treat regions or provinces a little bit differently. So I think for her, she's viewing it as you shouldn't just have exemptions if you have MPs in a province. You should have exemptions based on solid public policy, based on good evidence. And I think Sabrina was pointing out, there are studies out there that show that these regulations are very difficult for Alberta to meet. So I think the premier, while she's playing a bit of politics, I think she is a leader of a province. She should be defending her constituents and the businesses in her province. And I think she's doing a good job in that regard. So we'll see where this ends up. It's just very funny to me. They have the same kind of policy objectives, but they just can't find a way to make it work, even though they want to reach that same goal of kind of a clean grid. The timeline is obviously an issue, but ultimately, hopefully, they can find a way to kind of negotiate this. But for the premier, I do think public policy-wise, she's making a good argument.
Yeah, that's what I find so interesting, Laura. Like, I feel like there are arguments to be made and the policy around it makes sense. So then why throw the Sovereignty Act in there, which essentially says, like, let's flout the law, right?
Well, I think both sides are girding for a fight here. I mean, it is so interesting that they're not ideologically opposed on the concept of net zero. They're off by a decade and a half. And I think that Shakir is absolutely right that Premier Danielle Smith smells blood here. She sees the government weakened by the carbon tax carve out, by some court cases that they've lost in the past. And so she's here, touting what was one of her signature policies. And this is very political to her. And I think, but on the flip side, it is very political for the federal government as well. I mean, you don't often see the federal environment minister making jokes and looking so relaxed as he did in that scrum, making his jokes about Maverick and Top Gun. I had laughed out loud during that, but listen, I think the federal Liberals know that the public is on their side in the concept of net zero. They know that this is where the business world is going. This is where the world is going, and so I think they do have support from the public on that. Whether that can be achieved in 2035, 2040, 2050, that is obviously the battle that they're going to have, but they're not far off on the end game here, which both sides, I think, acknowledge is going to happen.
Do you think there's something beneficial politically, Kathleen, in it for the Liberals to also take on this fight?
Oh, for sure. And let's face it, Premier Smith has made Minister Guilbeault her target for a long time. I mean, there is some deep, deep hatred that exists, it seems, between those two. And I think that while you saw the Liberals, wasn't a strong flank behind him, but, you saw obviously a Calgary MP and obviously other Liberal MPs behind him. But they have to take on this fight with her, because if other provinces fall or they sense weakness, as my colleagues have said, but I think actually Minister Guilbeault, to give him a bit more credit than my colleagues have, he has said in op-eds and in other places, he said it in his scrum today, that 2030 is not a cliff. 2035, is not a cliff. That they will give Alberta more time if needed. And I think that that's the unreasonableness that where Premier Smith is approaching this.
But I didn't hear him say that they'd give him more time.
He said it's not a cliff. January 1st is not a cliff. That if they need a little bit more time, and he did an op-ed on October 27th where he actually basically said, this is not point final, and the point is that these regulations are still being negotiated. So come to the table and negotiate them, talk it out, as opposed to just, as Sabrina said, throwing the grenade in of the Sovereignty Act.
What's your sense, Sabrina? Is it that she smells weakness in the federal government's position right now because of all the back and forth on the carbon tax exemptions in Atlantic Canada, as Shakir pointed out, or are there other reasons informing the invocation of the Sovereignty Act, do you think?
I think for sure she smells weakness, and I think that what's happened, in Atlantic Canada and on the court cases has really fueled her fire. But I think she also faces a really tough political landscape in Alberta. She lost a lot of the members that she was seeking to put onto the UCP board. It's been pretty much taken over by Take Back Alberta, which is a radical fringe element, I'd say, in conservative politics here in this province. And she's got to kind of come to the table with the things that she said she was going to do. She said she was going to pick fights with Ottawa. That's what she's doing. She did it last month on the Alberta Pension Plan. She's doing it now on the Sovereignty Act. But I think, going that political route for Danielle Smith, as opposed to also thinking about economics in this province, is questionable, right? So we heard the minister say, and George Shahal say multiple times, that she's risked $30 billion of investment, 24,000 jobs with the moratorium on renewables. So, I think there's a bit of a balance for Danielle Smith to walk on whether or not she actually makes good business decisions with this Sovereignty Act and by pushing back on the electricity regulations.
There was something else, Shakir, I picked up during Minister Guilbeault's comments. It was like the invocation of Pierre Poilievre and the federal Conservatives and the kind of trying to align them with the province of Alberta and Danielle Smith, that they're a party that denies the existence of climate change. They don't want to do anything to mitigate the effects of it. What impacted you from that?
Not much, to be quite honest. I mean, I've seen since the fall economic statement, the Liberals are actually having some fight, which is great to see. They're finally pushing back against Pierre. They're finally trying to characterize him in some kind of a way. So honestly, good for them. And they're trying to show some life. But I think Minister Guilbeault's comments were kind of throwaway comments, right? The Liberals always say, the Conservatives don't believe in climate change and this and that. But that's just not a factual statement. So I don't think it's going to have much effect moving forward. I think in terms of Danielle Smith's political positioning, though, I think Sabrina is bang on. I think ultimately you asked her, why wasn't this raised in negotiations, right? Like, why didn't you say you were going to, use constitutional kind of provisions to kind of not implement these regulations? She didn't answer that question. And I think if she didn't table this as a potential thing to move forward on, the fact that she's so public about it now, it makes me think that she's signaling to a group of people that, hey, I'm going to fight on this issue because I'm getting political pressure to kind of move forward on this, right? And as much as she's the Premier of Alberta, she's the leader of a political party. And there are those factions in the UCP who love a good tussle with Ottawa. And I think Danielle Smith now is just really leaning into that, right? Unnecessarily, but really leaning into that right now to play to that element in her party.
I think also from that element, there are a lot of pressures to move forward on more socially conservative policies, Laura. This, I think, provides something in the window that can divert, can satisfy those factions without having to proceed on other stuff that she doesn't seem as convinced is worth pursuing politically because of the way in which it might backfire with the broader public.
I think that's such a smart point. I mean, this is something that, even moderate Liberals like Sabrina can get behind, and can say, look, I at least know where she's coming from on this, and to even have some agreement on the panel, from different political parties, I think shows that there is some sense that this could be unfair on the part of Ottawa. So I think that's a very smart point to make, and probably she's more politically vulnerable on some of those other issues and some of the other people within her caucus. I will just say, though, regarding the Pierre Poilievre point, I think that is going to be something that the Liberals are going to be targeting on. We haven't heard from the Conservatives what their plan on climate change has been. Pierre Poilievre dodges that question every time, saying he'll talk about that in the election, which could be 2 years away. So I think the Liberals are going to be drawing this in at every opportunity because they know that regardless of what's happened with their carbon tax snafu, that this is something that the broader public cares about. They care about climate change. They want to see a plan. They want a plan that makes sense. And there will be a lot of pressure on the federal Conservatives to come up on one. So I'm sure that they'll be roping Danielle Smith in with Pierre Poilievre on that issue as much as they possibly can.
Okay, on that note, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much to our front bench tonight. Appreciate the discussion. Sabrina Grover, Shakir Chambers, Kathleen Monk, and Laura Stone.